So we're very lucky to be joined today by Cristín Leach. Cristín has been art critic with the Sunday Times for nearly 20 years. She's been shortlisted for Critic of the Year at the Newsbrand's Ireland Journalism Awards. She is president of the Irish branch of the Arts Critic Association. She's had fiction and personal essays published in winter papers, and most recently she has published her memoir, Negative Space, which is a memoir about writing and art as a salve, as a means of escape, marriage as a refuge and a trap, the nature of home, a failing relationship, and what happens when everything falls apart. It's been very well received, some great praise. Kevin Barry describes it as original, intense, always compelling, and a highly accomplished debut. Louise O'Neill describes it as a beautiful book, raw, honest, and vulnerable, searingly intimate, and thought-provoking, and many others. Cristín, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Neil. It's great to be here.
12 o'clock in this chapel on a Sunday, I feel like I'm giving mass.
Yeah.
Before we jump into the book, I'd love to spend just a few minutes talking to you about you and your career as an art critic. And one story that jumped out for me in the first chapter is your career as a critic seems to have begun at a very young age, at the age of 8, writing for the RT Guide. Will you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. I entered a competition when I was 8 to write book reviews for the RT Guide. The reason that the story about that is in the book is that it's a memory I have from my childhood of a really anxious time, actually, how difficult it was to write that review. And I remember almost having what I think now is probably like a type of mild panic attack, maybe just an anxiety attack, but it was around this idea of how important it was to get the words right, you know. And I was a big reader. I learned to read when I was 3, so I was reading before I started school, and reading was part of my identity as well as writing being part of my identity. So I was writing a review of James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. That's what the review was of. And my mum, I think, is the person who had found that there was this competition. We were living in rural Kilkenny, and she helped me write it by, like, I was panicking. I was like, I can't do this. And she said, just tell me what you thought of the book. Just tell me. And so I started talking. She wrote down what I said. And then she said, now you can copy that out in your own handwriting. That's what you said. They're only your words. And we sent it in, and I won the competition. Now, I wasn't the only one who won. They gave that prize to a number of kids in different categories. And then I had a period of months where I was reviewing books for the RT Guide, so they were appearing on the books page, which was edited by Mary Finn. And then I had a relationship with an editor, I guess, you know, at that young age. So it was really formative for me, that idea that I could write my opinions about something and that they would be published. How remarkable, you know, to get your name. Actually, at that time, they published your age and your full postal address in the RT Guide with your full name. Talk about child safety.
The age of 8.
In the 1980s. It said Cristín Leach, age 8, and my full postal address. But it was amazing, yeah. And so that was really formative for me. Yeah. And the reason it came back as a memory when I was writing this book was because a lot of what's in this book is about feeling extreme emotions and around, I suppose, around words and writing, and then also how I have all my life, as long as I can remember, used that action of writing down what I think, writing down what I feel, as a way of anchoring myself when my emotions feel big.
Yes.
And I think it was something that really started a long time ago. Yeah. And then the book is about my marriage breaking, and when that happened, the anxiety came back. And I remembered that feeling in my body of panic.
Yes.
And it was all connected with words. It was very interesting. I didn't know that was going to happen. It's just something that happened. So it was an interesting thing to think about in terms of how I was going to structure the memoir as well.
There's a Seamus Heaney quote that you have in there that I actually wrote down, and I think it's sort of his explanation maybe of what a writer is, and it's someone who estimates their own identity through how well they write. So at the age of 8, you were feeling like that.
That was quite extreme, isn't it?
Yeah.
And but I kept diaries, I kept notebooks, like I just, what was it? I don't know. I mean, maybe it was because I was reading so young, but I had this idea that writing and words were a way of capturing things, you know, pinning them down, you know. And then also, it wasn't even about expressing myself to other people as much as it was about expressing myself to myself. But I do think that panic I was feeling about entering that competition was around the idea that someone else was going to judge my writing. So that was another thing. And a big theme in the book is that idea of being right and wrong, being judged, you know, like what is good, what is not good, you know, like what's worthy of attention, what's not worthy of attention, and all of those things. And then, of course, I didn't think about becoming a critic again until much later. And I didn't realize that that had been so formative until much later. I did a master's in journalism at DCU when I was 21.
That's interesting, yeah. So you are an art critic journalist.
Yes, yeah.
What is that specifically, and how does that sort of, or how has that informed how you've critiqued art?
It is a dying practice, I have to say. I feel like we're almost extinct. And the reason for that is that there's not a lot of work for art critic journalists. And I decided I wanted to be an art critic who wrote for newspapers. It was a deliberate decision. And also broadcasting was something that had been really important to me. I joined a radio station when I was in college in UCC doing my undergraduate. So, and the reason I felt that was important was I wanted to talk about art in a realm that wasn't the art world realm. And I felt like that work could expand audiences for art. So the idea of my writing being in a Sunday supplement where somebody would be reading about Colin Farrell in a film, reading about a new book by Anne Enright, and then turn the page and see a review of an exhibition, that they would maybe read that even if they thought, I'm not that interested in art. And again, it came back to that thing of, if I can write something good enough that somebody will want to read it, even if they think they're not interested in art, then that, I think it was partly the challenge of that, you know, but you're battling within that system of the media and newspaper publishing for space. And my job is freelance, so it's not a staff job. I've been freelance since 2003, and I've come and gone from it. There have been times when I haven't written for a long time and come back, so I'm pitching ideas to an editor, and the editor has competing ideas about what should be on the page all the time. So you're battling for space, and again, it was this idea of, if you're not really putting words that are worth reading on the page, then, you know, it's not a given. It's not a given that there'll be a space for this exhibition.
So it's not good enough just to expose the audience to this new art or expose new art to a new audience. It's actually that the quality of the writing and you reviewing the art stands out, I guess.
It was like, how do you tell a story about this that people will be interested in? And what I think I discovered over time was, if I really spend time with the art and have a very personal response to it and somehow channel that, like, I think of the critic as a conduit for the audience, you know? And also, like, I don't think the critic's view on the thing is the only view. I want there to be space in the writing for people to go, well, I don't agree with that, or you've made me think about this other thing in my life. So yeah, I've actually started a PhD about art criticism as journalism, so I'm going to do a PhD by prior publication, which is based on my work that I've done to date. But I don't know where the space for this is going forward, you know. I'm not that interested in writing for specialist publications because I think it's the art world talking to the art world. And that's okay, there's a space for that, it's fine, but it's not what I really want to do, you know.
Because there is something in that, like, I even look to myself, I'm not a musician or a singer, but I have opinions and views on music. Yeah. I'm not a director or an actor, but I have opinions on plays and films. I don't have strong opinions on art, and to take a step further, I sometimes feel like I'm not entitled to have opinions on art. Yeah. Am I a complete Philistine, or is that a phenomenon that you come across?
I think this is really interesting. So if you think about it, in school, go back into our childhood, every one of us who attends school in Ireland is taught how to pull apart a piece of text, yes, how to read a poem, how to read a book, and write something opinionated about it. Whether you like doing that or not, you're taught how to do it. We are not taught how to analyse, look at, and pull apart visual things. We're not, like, I think art education should also be about, how do I engage with this? We only teach students that art, like the subject of art in school, is making art. Why aren't we educating audiences? Like, every one of us is audience. Some people will be artists, but everybody in the room is audience. The same for music, the same for film. I think that we need to shift the way we think about that at a much early stage, like right down in primary school, you know, and the galleries are changing the way that they work, and there are brilliant education programs that didn't exist when I was a kid. I was brought into galleries from when I was really small because my mum's an artist. Okay. So I don't feel like a gallery is a strange place. I actually feel at home in galleries. Like, she used to say I was going to exhibitions when I was in the womb. I'm the first of 4 kids. So I feel at home when I walk into a gallery, and I know other people don't feel at home when they walk into a gallery, but I do. So I thought maybe, like, I can take that feeling that I have and try and open the door for more people, yes, you know.
I've heard you talk before about your particular way of reviewing art, and the moment of encounter,
Yeah.
which I just think is a beautiful idea. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, when I was thinking about my practice and why it is in newspapers and maybe on the radio and not in other places, I also had to think about what's my motivation, you know, like why am I a critic? And I know that some critics are more interested in writing about the moment of creation. So they want to go into the studio and figure out to write about why the artist was making it, what their influences were. And I'm interested in that too, but what drives my writing, I hope, and what makes me excited when I'm writing is trying to articulate what it felt like to stand in front of the work or to walk around the work, or, you know, like when I'm looking at sculptures, I go under them and over them and I try to look at the back of paintings and the sides of paintings, and, you know, it takes time. I spend a long time in exhibitions and I write a lot of notes, and I write them in a really stream of consciousness way. Mm-hmm. So I'm just looking and I'm writing. My handwriting is terrible. Nobody else will be able to understand it. And I'm writing words and ideas, and I feel like if anybody spends long enough with a work of art, what's been put into it by the artist will reveal itself. And it takes time, and it's also a slow practice. You have to go quiet. Hey, I don't like people talking to me when I'm looking at art. Mm-hmm. I don't like when gallery owners come up and say, do you want me to tell you about the work? I'm like, no, don't tell me about the work. I don't want to know what you think about the work. I'm trying to find out what I think about it, you know? So I developed a practice of not interviewing artists. Now I've started interviewing artists since, and I have done studio visits and essays around that since. But in my early years, I deliberately didn't talk to the artist. Yes. I didn't read the press release. Like in the very beginning, I was reading the press release because I was like, how am I going to write this? I don't know what I'm doing, right? I was 26, I think, when I started writing for the Sunday Times. So, you know, and I was looking to other critics. I was reading like Robert Hughes, and I was reading all these people, and you know, the more hyperbolic and opinionated you can be, of course. Like there's a piece in the book, it's a quote from, I think it's Peter Sheldal, who just died recently, the US critic, about how art criticism is a type of performance, you know, but you have to bring that to the page to make people interested in what you're reading. And of course, I don't always do it. Some of the pieces I've written, people are probably going to read the first paragraph and turn the page. But like the job of a journalist is to keep you reading to the end, you know. And if it's a practice of journalism, you put the most gripping hook at the beginning. You use that pyramid structure of writing. So the headline grabs the person, and we don't write the headlines. The journalists don't write the headlines, the subs do. But and then you're trying to pull somebody in with a story at the beginning, and hopefully they'll stay with you to the end.
That really chimes, actually. I was at an interesting event last night where Kevin Power and Rob Doyle were speaking. So they're authors in their own right, but they also review books.
Yeah.
And they were asked sort of what's the purpose of a book review, and said, well, there's the obvious, which is to just, you know, let people know about a book. But it was Rob, I think, had a very honest answer. He said when he's writing, an element of him is showing off, that he wants that writing to be good. And he's released this sort of compendium of a mishmash of his various writings and reviews and things like that over the last few years. So I wonder, when you were writing your art reviews, at the back of your mind, did you always have in the back of your mind that you would pull it together in some shape or form, or preserve those written pieces in a way that ultimately ended up being this, but could have been anything?
Well, that's a story I can tell you about how this book happened, I suppose.
For sure.
Because I didn't initially, but when I had been writing for the Sunday Times for about 10 years, I did start thinking about that. And I pulled together a manuscript, which would have been like a collection, I guess, a kind of a best of. But I also thought, there doesn't really exist in Ireland a book you can buy that you could read that would tell you this type of stuff about contemporary art, you know. So I pulled that manuscript together and I pitched it to 8 publishers over a period of about 4 years. And none of them would publish it because they said there wasn't a big enough market in Ireland for a book of art criticism, just art criticism. And I was showing them examples of books published in the US, and of course there's a big population in the US, and I was going, well, look at all these male art critics with their books of their criticism, what can we publish? So, and there was one publisher who was very interested and said, if you had a bigger TV profile, we could publish it. So it was this thing of like, you know, if people knew your face more and all of that. Then my marriage fell apart, and I just like, no, I'm not going to try and push that anymore as an idea. And then I was looking to do the PhD, and they had said to me, if your work was in a collection published in a book, it would be much easier to frame your application for a PhD by prior publication. So I went back to Merriam Press which is a sub-imprint of Irish Academic Press. And I said to the publisher there, Conor Graham, we were on a Zoom call because it was still lockdown times, I said, I'd like to pitch another version of this book, because he was very interested in it actually. And I said, how about if I wrote personal essays and they were published, and I wrote them to talk about what was going on in my life when I saw the work. And my idea for the structure was that I would write a personal essay and then the exhibition review would be published in its entirety next to it. There would be a parallel structure. And he said, no, don't know about that structure, tell me a bit more. And I told him the story, which is in the book, about being in the family law court in Cork and looking up and seeing Maud Cotter's sculpture hanging from the ceiling. And I'd been there before and I'd never noticed it. And it's called Home. And I had this feeling like, oh, wow, this is a space in which the legal system is, you know, legally and carefully taking homes apart because it's dealing with separations and divorces. And I was so struck by the fact that was hanging there. Now, actually, the story about that is that she made it when that was a criminal court, and she made it because it was a response to the idea of what a jail cell might be like and the notions of home and where prisoners were going. But for me at that time then, it was about this place is about taking homes apart, you know, and this is the home. So I told Conor that story and he said, that's interesting, Cristín. Could you write a bit more about that? So I then went away and pitched a structure, which was 8 essays. So this was commissioned as a book of 8 essays. He said, look, I don't think that idea of publishing the entire exhibition review is a good one. You can blend it in. So that's why the book is structured in that way. The criticism is blended in. It's there are extracts and pieces, not more than usually a paragraph. And there are also, which wouldn't have been in that other book, extracts from my notebooks. And my notebooks are very different. That stream of consciousness, you know, they're, some of it is similar to what's published, but I write the notebooks for me. So I have extracts from the notebooks in there as well as extracts from the published pieces and other pieces of writing that I never intended to publish at all. So, yeah.
And so for those other pieces, I mean, if you look at say, some of your art review work, you probably are there between the lines. You, as you say, through the moment of encounter, you bring a certain amount of yourself to it. Yeah. Then you turn to the memoir and you don't have to read between the lines, you're right there.
Yeah.
How did you navigate that, and what challenges did you face? And I guess what I'm specifically getting at is just bringing so much of yourself and so much of your personal life into the public, and then also how you navigate that in respect of other people who were in your life at that time. Yeah.
I think when I sat down to write this, I still thought I was writing 8 essays. And 8 essays, even though they're personal essays, there's a little barrier there of, you know, this is a personal essay. And memoir crosses over into something a bit more intense, right? And what happened when I sat down and started to pull it together was I realized that this was the book that I had to write now. That it was just the book that was in me was this. And I had a lot of, again, it comes back to that idea of writing things down when my feelings are intense. So a lot of what's in the book, descriptions of, you know, like very bodily descriptions of panic and being very stressed. There was a point in my life where I was checking the windows and doors, the locks of the windows and doors in the house. Anxiety, you know. I was writing that stuff down. For myself in notebooks, on my phone, I was writing things down.
You've one scene where it's after the text messages come through in the affairs when you're having a conversation with your ex-husband and you're writing down things on Post-its.
On Post-its.
It was probably the one time I had sympathy with your ex-husband in the whole book.
Yeah, and a lot of people have said that to me actually.
Did you have, and I was kind of interested when I was reading the personal essays, were they written sort of contemporaneously at the time? Or were they written, you know, 6, 7, 8 years later, looking back at them now in the context of this book?
Yeah, the book is written later, but the way I wrote it, just practically speaking, was I sat down at my laptop. I had an essay called Writing, which I had already written. It had the Seamus Heaney anecdote in it, actually, about listening to Seamus Heaney talking about writing on the radio and driving in the Dublin Mountains with my kids in the back of the car. That was in that essay I'd written, which was called Writing, and that I'd never sent that essay anywhere. And I think it also included the stuff about the RT Guide. It was me trying to understand my origins as a writer. I wrote it, I think I wrote that in 2016. I never submitted it anywhere, I just wrote it. So I pulled it out and I thought, okay, this could be the first chapter, say, or first essay. And then the other titles of seeing, listening came. And so I had these 8 titles for the essays. And I started to look on my laptop and pull bits of writing. Like I was going to say hoarder, I'm an archivist. I keep all my writing. I have those transcribed notes going back right to 2003, I think, in files on USBs and whatever. And all the notebooks as well, actually, although I probably couldn't read my writing from back then anymore. But I was pulling these things, and then I was thinking, I remember writing a note on my phone that day when something happened. Say, you know, I had found some receipts or something, and I rang my friend in a panic, actually shaking. And she was like, you're going to put the phone down, you're going to do 5 press-ups, and you're going to ring me back. And she's in the book, she's not named though. So the thing about also the people around me, and she was right, it was adrenaline. I had to get it out of my body. Did 5 press-ups, not very well, and rang her back. She was like, how do you feel? And I said, I'm okay, I'm going to, you know. But those things, like those memories of feeling that type of panic, like I actually feel panicked now talking about that. Like the adrenaline in your body, it's a muscle memory. It's like, it's there, you know. And then speaking about, I suppose, the way that I handle the people in my life, because if you are telling your own story in a memoir, it's obviously not just your story. You're all the people. Nobody exists in a bubble, you know. They're all the people around you. So the way the book is structured is nobody who's very close to me is named by name. My children aren't named, you know. Those friends even aren't named. And then the further away the people get from me in terms of being like a person I have a professional relationship, their name is in there. So like my co-presenter for the radio show, the names of the artists, curators I worked with. So there's this kind of, what I did was I thought about, you know, my intimate story has mostly only me in it. It's me, it's my perspective. And the whole book is me and my perspective. And I had to make decisions about which parts of that to own, you know. I took a lot out. I had a manuscript, before I sent it to the publisher, I went through it and I took 10,000 words out.
Really?
Yeah, so there's 10,000 words that no one's ever seen. I didn't show them to anybody.
And was the length of the book, so when you were talking previously about the moment of encounter, I find the length of the book quite interesting because I'm not the world's quickest reader, so to the extent I have moments of encounter with books, they're spread over months.
Yeah.
But I read your book, not quite in one sitting, but in 2 sittings, so I feel like I had pretty much one moment of encounter with your book.
Yeah.
Was the length of the book something that you focused on in terms of how you're structuring it, or is that just how it ended up?
I wanted it to be possible to read it in one sitting.
Okay.
I wanted it to be, and also I had very little time to write it, so but I don't think I had any more I wanted to put in there, you know. A journalist who interviewed me about it said she felt like it was written in a fever dream. That's what she felt as a reader reading it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I think because it's driven by this impetus of the panic, the text message repeats like a beat. I thought of it also as an album. This might sound strange, but I've
actually heard you talk about this before, and I love that idea. Yeah.
So I was trying to figure out, how do I write these 8 essays and tell the story again and again, maybe through a different lens? You know, this is writing, this is seeing, this is listening, and I'm kind of repeating myself. And I was like, how is that going to be okay for a reader if I'm repeating myself? Because when you're a journalist, if you've already said it in this paragraph, you don't say it again in this paragraph. That's why I thought about it as an album. I said, well, if it's an album of 8 songs, an album tells one story, but it could be 8 songs that tell the same story 8 different ways, you know, maybe with a slightly different point of view or something. So I thought about it as 8 songs in an album, which allowed me to repeat myself, but I also felt very strongly that thing of anxiety, panic, it's a repeating thing. It comes back. So, you know, if you are very anxious about something that's happened, it repeats as a memory, it keeps hitting you again and again, right? And I wanted to be able to sort of hit that again and again, maybe. Yeah, and like it had a very small amount of copy editing, which was interesting. It just went back and forth with the copy editor twice, I think maybe 3 times. Really? To tidy it up, yeah. And when it went to the publisher, that was in November. So I signed the contract for this in July. The manuscript was due in November. I did a small rewrite over Christmas, and then it was like copy edited in January, February, cover designed, and it was really tight.
It's very efficient. I'm very jealous.
I mean, and I know that's highly unusual in the publishing world, but Conor Graham was surprised when I had sent him the manuscript. It was due on the 15th of November. I sent it, and he wrote back and he said, "I love journalists. They always hit their deadline." It's like, well, that's how we get paid. So. But yeah, there was a lot about. my sister said to me when she read it that she kept reading because she wanted to find out what was going to happen to me. And I thought that was so interesting because she said, this is strange because I know what happened to you.
I assume she knew, yeah.
Of course. But she said, I was reading it because I wanted to find out what was going to happen to you. And I thought, okay, well, then I did something that worked. Because you know me.
The momentum, I guess.
Yeah, it was this idea of momentum. And I suppose it ties back to my feeling of how do I keep the reader hooked? Because my practice is writing about something that maybe you're not that interested in. Maybe I've actually started calling it a prickly practice, the prickly practice of art criticism as journalism, because it's like you're putting stuff in the paper that half the people don't think should be there at all. The artists all want it to be there. The galleries are sending me all these press releases saying, could you cover our show? Could you cover our show? There's not enough coverage for art. And then you've got people who are also turning the page and reading something else they're more interested in. So you're fighting for some sort of to get their attention. So like I think as a writer, that's I mean, talking about the challenge of it, like the performance of it, you're trying to do it really well all the time to keep people reading. So, and sometimes they don't keep reading.
Did you feel pressure to kind of put more of yourself into it, or to kind of expose more? Just before I read your book, and just coincidental timing, I read Fierce Appetites by Elizabeth Boyle.
Brilliant book.
Yeah.
And
she mentions in the book that she showed it to, I think, a colleague of hers, and they said, you're holding back. You need to
when
kind
she
of
was
go
doing
more.
her first draft.
Yes.
Yeah, she was writing that. I just met Elizabeth at the festival.
She was sat right there yesterday.
Yeah. And it's really interesting if you haven't read her book. My book and her book are kind of like these interesting dark twins of each other, aren't they?
They really are. And it was complete coincidence that I read them back to back. It was just one of those strange things.
And I don't know Elizabeth, well, I've met her now, but we didn't know each other. And when she read this and when I read her book, we both were like, oh, how interesting. These books kind of feel like they sit together in a strange way. Yeah, when she was drafting it at first, a colleague had said to her, you're holding too much back. I didn't show my drafts to anybody. I was really writing it for me. Now, I did show to my daughter, actually, 2 of the essays, and she was like, yeah, keep going. So that was important to me in terms of the people in my life, you know, to make sure the kids were okay with it. That was probably the priority, the main priority. Yeah, I personally didn't feel any pressure to put, not from the publisher or from anything, because really he had commissioned 8 essays. You know, I guess he could have sent the manuscript back and said these aren't good enough or whatever, but when he got it, he was like, I think if you could just do a tiny tweak on the first chapter and the last chapter to take account of the fact that we think this is a memoir. He said, it's not a book of 8 essays, it's a memoir, but it needs only a tiny amount of change. So I actually moved something that had been in the first chapter in the middle, I moved that up to the front. So I just did a bit of restructuring. And there was a lot more family history in the last chapter about my ancestors being journalists, and I took a lot of that out because it just wasn't interesting enough. It's interesting to me, you know. It just wasn't. It was like, yeah, this is personal sort of family history. It's not casting enough light on my experience, and I only need a little bit of it. I don't need all of it, you know. That's one of the things about writing, is like to know how much you need to give the reader for them to take it and run with it themselves. You don't have to tell them the whole story. Like, the reason it's called negative space is because, you know, the stuff that's not said also tells you stuff about, you know, looking at what someone doesn't say or hearing what someone doesn't say, you're learning something, you know, in the same way as I wrote about learning to draw by drawing the outline of something instead of the thing itself, and that my mum had taught me that. I'm also always looking at what the artist has left out, like what they haven't said, and I think that's interesting. But then, of course, as I say in the book, if you're not looking directly at the thing itself, you can miss things, right? So that's a metaphor for what I wasn't seeing in my marriage, obviously. Yeah, so there's a few layers to that, but...
That's sort of a jumping off point to maybe take us through an extract from your book,
oh, yeah.
if you wouldn't mind. There was a passage I had selected, I think it's at page 9, it's in your first chapter, Writing. Yeah. And I think it actually, in quite a short space, encapsulates a few of the themes that we've already touched on, so...
Yeah, so will I read a bit? Yeah,
yeah,
so
read
just
a bit,
short bit, okay. So this is from the chapter called Writing. Actually, I'll have a little sip of water. Okay. It is November 2014, and I am writing a book review for the Sunday Times when I get the text message to say my husband has been cheating on me. Even now, writing that sentence sends panic into my body. My hands get cold and start to shake. I had no idea that hand-wringing was a spontaneous, uncontrollable action directed from deep inside until that day. I thought it was a performative gesture enacted by characters in books, a visibly dramatic, handy shorthand for distress. I was reviewing Art and Architecture of Ireland, a 5-volume, 3,000-page tome with 10 different editors published by Yale University Press. I have had to go back into my laptop files to find this out because I have no memory of what I wrote or how I finished and filed the copy on time. I see that I wrote, "It's rare that a set of books matches the hyperbolic self-description that accompanies it, but in the case of this remarkable project from the Royal Irish Academy, the most comprehensive study of Irish art and architecture ever undertaken is a fair and accurate call." I do not remember reviewing this book, but I do remember that after the panic, the shock and the shaking, I did the work calmly and with focus. The words and the job were a refuge. I somehow put my feelings on hold to finish the writing task. My body was so full of adrenaline that instead of screaming or fighting, I went still and I went to work with words. Shock and panic came in waves in the weeks that followed as school runs and homework and dinner still had to happen as my world was falling apart. Initially, I told no one. Driving to Kilkenny 5 days later to see an exhibition, I sat in a gallery room in the basement of Kilkenny Castle and let artist Amy Walsh's video works fill my mind. Refuge from the endless repeat loops of panic, circular thoughts, pain, heartache. I sat there fully immersed. Art is an escape. Art is an embrace. Art shifts perspective. I wrote in my notebook, "You might imagine the vast proliferation of remarkable, beautiful, amazing, awe-inspiring, shocking, and even heart-melting images on the internet, made often by non-professionals with everyday equipment in various settings, has made us immune to any kind of special impact a digital image by an artist in a gallery could provide. You'd be wrong."
I mean, you could equally easily say that the text message you had received so recently and your life being in turmoil could make you immune to that. But what I love about that is, so you're obviously in this incredibly difficult period of your life, but you still managed to find a way to lose yourself in the art, to see the beauty in the art, which kind of speaks to art, and I guess your own writing is that sort of salve or safe place.
Yeah, I mean, in one way it's running away, it's disassociation. It's like, I'm going to sit at my laptop, I'm just going to, do this. And I return to that moment a few times in the book and describe it differently because I also did, as I say in another chapter, go outside and fill the potholes on the driveway. Like, I was drafting this article, and the way I work is I write a draft, I write another draft, I comb through it, like I comb through the piece each time, and I do a lot of editing. I would stop, and because the adrenaline was still there, it wasn't gone, and I hadn't talked to anybody. So, I went outside and I was digging gravel, filling the potholes, and then I was like, okay, back to the laptop, how many hours to the deadline, I gotta get this done, Because I wasn't gonna ring my editor and go, oh, my marriage is falling apart, I can't find my copy. I wasn't going to do that, And a newspaper gets published, you have to find your copy, you can't leave them with a blank page, so, yeah.
And I want to ask you, and if nothing obvious comes to mind, that's obviously fine, but in terms of you as a writer, how has your experience changed you? Has your experience of being married, going through the marriage, going through the separation, going through the divorce, changed you as a writer versus how you look at yourself as a writer now versus back then?
I mean, definitely writing a memoir and publishing a book has changed my idea of myself as a writer. My idea of myself as a writer had already started to shift. After the marriage ended, I had written a short story which was published in Winter Papers, and that was me going back to the idea that I could write fiction, so it's a work of fiction, and that it was good enough to be published, and that made me think, maybe there's other types of writing that I can do, that are good enough. And the other thing that happened was the pandemic. With everybody being shut inside in their houses, I was doing all this thinking about thresholds, like being inside, being outside, the fact that I couldn't see art in person, the galleries were closed, I was looking at things digitally, and that brought me back to this idea of being silent and speaking, words I had written for me, words I could share with other people. So there were this kind of, and I started thinking about how we don't talk a lot in Ireland about marital breakup. I started thinking about like who's being silenced, why am I silencing myself? You know, I started thinking about judgment and all of these things, and I think as well, when your marriage falls apart, it's like one of the worst things that could possibly happen. It felt to me like my whole life had broken. And once I'd come through that, you know, we were divorced, living in separate houses, the kids were okay. It was like, well, what's the worst that can happen? You know, it felt like, oh my God, you know, I'm still here, you know, I'm on the other side of this. Yeah, so there were a lot of different things going on, but even to come to a book festival and be the writer, like the person who wrote the book, you know, like I do lots of event hosting as well. I'm normally doing the interviewing, you know. So like that's also a shift in my notion of who I am and who I might be, you know. Yeah.
And that seems to be something, so one of the things I did, right, in preparing for this is I went on to various websites where there's user reviews of the book.
Good, I didn't do that.
Almost universally positive. And one of the things that a lot of the comments were about was that point you make about divorce and separation and the breakup of marriages not being something that we speak about in Ireland.
Yeah.
And it sort of made me think when you were talking about the moment of encounter with the piece of art isn't necessarily what the artist intended. And I wonder, is the way in which people have connected with your book through those personal essays, was that something that you intended at the time, you expected at the time, or is that something you've experienced in terms of people, you know, talking to you about your book?
I've been amazed at how many people have read it. I think because I've been told my entire career that my writing is niche. It's for a niche audience. Writing about art is niche, and I don't believe that actually. I don't believe that's true. But I think there's a bigger audience there for it, but and not just my writing, but writing about art in general. So because that's kind of what I thought, well, I'll write this book and I'll publish this book, and maybe some people will read it, you know. So I wasn't really thinking a lot about what kind of reach it would have, and as I said, I was applying for that PhD, so it was like a tool for me in that way. But I have had messages from people who have said, you put words on my experience. I've had people I don't know who've just said, thank you for writing that. So I didn't expect or anticipate that would happen, but I see how that could be, you know, for people reading it. And of course, it's just my experience, it's not anyone else's experience, but some things are universal, you know, like shock and panic and all of those things. And there's much more I could have written, of course. I could have written a very different book. But I think I'm glad that I have written a book about this that weaves my professional practice and my world into my personal experience. And also because I'm a writer and I'm pleased when something takes a good shape, like I'm quite satisfied and pleased with the shape of the book, you know, it pleases me. So I think it's that thing of like you're writing first for yourself. Virginia Woolf said, you know, you're writing first to please yourself. I just thought, okay, I'm pleased with this, I can stand by it, I feel it has integrity. And that's good enough for me. So if it speaks to someone else, good, you know. And the things that aren't in it, I think, are things that happen in people's head when they read it, you know. So,
for sure,
right.
And that's the idea,
exactly.
Leaving space for the reader.
Yeah, and you as much as I bring my experience to a work of art, when I look at it, everybody does that. You know, if you listen to a song and it makes you start crying, it's because it's triggered something in you, you know. Like the song has triggered a memory, a feeling that you have felt, you know. It's not all held in the song, you know. So if the book has space for other people's experience to butt up against mine or meet mine, or even if, like somebody said to me that the book doesn't say what's in the text message. It doesn't tell you, but somebody
That's
said
almost that idea of negative space.
Negative
again,
space, and also, but somebody said to me when I said that, they said, "Oh, but I'm sure it does," and I said, "No, it doesn't."
They had written it.
They had their own idea in their head of what was in the text message, and I said, "That's actually brilliant. I'm so glad that you have that idea in your head." And they told me what they thought it was, and it wasn't what it was. But I'm very happy for readers to project their own ideas, thoughts, experience, whatever onto the story, because then it also lifts it up and out of just being my story, you know, and maybe allows it to be something a bit more universal, even though it's so particular to me, like, you know, and my life experience and what I was doing at the time and all of that. So yeah, I think good writing, good art, good music, good films, leave space for the audience or the viewer or the listener or whatever to have their personal experience with the work, you know. That's how you connect to it, you know. Otherwise, you're just reading someone else's story, you know. So,
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I have one more question. Well, actually, I have loads more questions, but I'll limit myself to one more question before I pass over to the audience. And it was just to pick up something you mentioned there, that normally you're in my chair and I'm in your chair.
Yeah.
How did it feel putting something out into the world and exposing it to criticism versus being the critic?
Well, I'd be a terrible critic if I didn't welcome criticism. So yeah, absolutely. I've seen a few reviews that have said there's too much of the art criticism in it. Like a few people who said they were skipping those bits because they just wanted to read about the personal stuff. And of course, that's okay. You know, that's once you hand your book to somebody, it's theirs to read and encounter in their own way. I've been really lucky. I've had good reviews. People have responded really well to it, and I've been really lucky to be invited to take part in festivals too, which is a brilliant way to kind of explore, pull apart the book. Part of me is waiting for someone to write a review that totally pulls it apart, because that's the practice, you know. I shouldn't invite that, you know. But
if they did that, would you look at that critically and go, well, that's quite a concise and measured and cogent, skewering of my book? Or
yes, if it was, if it was, I would absolutely accept that. And also, there's always an element of performance in a very negative review. There always is. There's an element of ta-da and look how clever I'm doing. And I'm not judging that actually, because it's part of the practice. But there is a difference between a mean takedown and a really intelligent, proper engagement with any piece of work. I've written negative reviews, and they are harder to write, I think, because you have to justify every single negative thing you're saying. And you can't make any mistakes. If there's a single error, factual error in a negative review, you will be pulled up on it.
In a way that it just won't in a positive review.
Yeah, and also, like, human beings remember the negative stuff. So I've written reviews where it's been like pretty much glowing review of the show, but maybe 2 sentences of this particular work didn't work, or this, whatever. And that's the bit that the artist remembers, the one line of the negative, because we're primed to really, like, make that loom larger, that's human nature. But I really respect the practice of criticism, literary criticism as well. I think, like, I love reading brilliant critics, and obviously negative reviews are fun to read as the reader, but really glowing positive reviews are also fun to read if they're well written. So in answer to your question, I would absolutely accept a negative review if it was really engaging well with the text, because I would learn something from it.
Yeah.
I think, and I could also say, well, I don't agree with that person, but for me, I think it depends on where the critic is coming from. Like, we've all seen hatchet jobs, and you think, well, where's that coming from?
Yeah.
But I believe, this is where I come from anyway as a critic, the critic is like a professional audience member. That's what you are. And I personally want to be wowed. I want all of it to be brilliant. I'm not going around looking for things to be negative about. But I also think, like, that's how we improve. Like, in art school, you have that process of having critiques, and can leave people devastated. Oh my God, my work is terrible. But then also, when you get over that bit, maybe it pushes you to do something else, or maybe it's hard to look at your own flaws and to look at what you've done, what you could improve. It's hard for everybody. But yeah, so look, yeah, the short answer is I think criticism is important, like professional, proper, good quality criticism, and I think it's a dying practice. So book criticism, everything. I would love to see more space for all of that. And for people to be able to develop that practice, because I think it's something, because it's become a freelance job almost completely, cultural criticism, all of it is pretty much freelance. We don't have staff critics so much anymore. It becomes something that people don't get time to develop over years, and it takes time to get good at being a critic, because you learn at what you've done wrong and what you haven't done well,
Yes.
So I think we need to look at that too. So it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, doesn't it?
Yeah, full circle.
Yeah.
Okay, might just pause there for a minute and see if anyone in the audience has any questions. And we do have a roving mic for the benefit of the recording.
Sorry. just to say that I've been reading your columns for years in the Sunday Times, and I actually love good critical writing. I find I've so much pleasure in it, as much as I do in all the books I read, which is kind of non-stop. So thanks very much for the enjoyment you've given me.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to reading your book.
I love reading great critical writing. I have, I'm the one who buys those books of collections of criticism. I'm the audience for it. Yeah, I think it's wonderful.
Question at the front here. Sorry, just one sec.
Hiya, just two things. One is, do you think much about the language that you're using, and did you use different language in your criticism and then in your essays? And I'm thinking specifically about the language, and could you comment something about the language that you use when you're critiquing art?
Yeah.
That's one. And can I ask a second question? Is that
sure?
Sorry,
yeah.
Oh God, the second question's gone for me.
I'll answer the one about language first, will I? So that's all about audience. So the language I use and the tone of voice I use and the structure of the sentences and everything, it's all about audience. So if I'm writing for a Sunday newspaper reader, I'm not going to use a lot of art speak. I'm going to keep my sentences short. When I'm doing my editing, I'm going down going, okay, that could be split into 2 sentences, not 1. I'm editing out stuff that's the type of stuff maybe that the gallery text might have in it, just because I'll lose the reader. So yeah, absolutely. And then I suppose with the book, I think maybe I just wrote something that I would have read myself in a memoir. I don't know. A lot of the language in this comes from the fact that a lot of the material was written in the immediate time. So I wasn't going back trying to remember how I felt. I actually had those notes that I had made for myself. So I was transcribing them or finding them wherever they were and pulling them into the manuscript. So I wasn't going, how did that feel in my body? I actually wrote down about my hands shaking. I wrote that down somewhere. It was like, oh, I need to capture that or something, So I wasn't looking back and writing with a lens on the past. Actually, those were the words that I had written down at the time for me. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to just ask, it's a similar question to what Niall was asking about the life experiences changing how you actually, how you write, right?
Yeah.
So before and after 2014, is there a change? My question is about how you actually perceive and look at the art, okay, before and afterwards, because you kind of talk about using the art as a refuge, compartmentalizing it. I'm not sure that it's possible to do that, and I was interested in the piece you're talking about, being in the court, looking at the sculpture, and then your perception of that piece possibly changing. Is that something that, does the life experience when it's so raw change how you look at art as well as changing how you write about art?
Ooh, interesting. I don't think my practice of looking, because looking is also a practice, I don't think my practice of looking changed as such in terms of that encounter thing. And also, looking is something, I do it in nature. Like when I'm walking in the woods, I stop and I look really intensely at flowers and things. So looking is a practice. I don't know how to articulate that better, but I suppose what I pulled out in the book, so I write about an exhibition I reviewed which was about risk, and an exhibition I reviewed, that was in the Crawford, and an exhibition I reviewed about love in IMA. And you wouldn't have known reading my review of the love exhibition at IMA that I was in bits. My marriage was falling apart. I was reviewing an exhibition about love. That review appeared in the paper. But when you read the book, you do know that was going on in my life, and I wrote something about love not being fixed, like not being immutable, and I'm writing that because of how I'm feeling. But when you were reading the views in the paper, you wouldn't know that. I mean, maybe that's some sort of universal truth, I don't know. So I think maybe part of the writing of the book was revealing some of that, But to answer your question about, I don't think it's changed how I feel about encountering work and looking at work.
It doesn't change the looking.
I don't think so, no. And that for me is a quiet stillness. maybe it goes back to my childhood. I spent a lot of time in nature, like just lying around in fields and climbing trees and looking at moss and you know, things like that, you know, looking at the sky through my eyelids, all this sort of stuff, you know, it was a looking thing. So, and then the thing about putting words on what does that look like, you know, so I don't think the practice changed, but it calms me to go into galleries, it calms me to look at art because I have to slow down, yeah, so thank you.
The book is wonderful.
Oh, thanks very much.
We probably have time for one more question if there is one. And if not, I have one. The last question I want to ask you is if you can say, what's next? What are you working on now? If we bring you back next year, what will we be talking to you about?
Oh God, well I've actually been commissioned to write a book for the RHA, so that might be a more slightly art world book, but the RHA is turning 200 next year. So I'm writing a book which is called A Portrait of the RHA in 12 Stories. So it's a book of 12 stories that spans those 200 years. So that's commissioned work. So that hopefully will be out next year. The RHA will be publishing that. But I've also been kind of on the side in another document, putting stuff into another document, which may be another book of essays. There's 8 essays there. I'll see. I don't have a contract or any kind of deadline for that, so I'm letting it just maybe grow. You know, so I'll see. But I think there's more to explore here, like having opened up some of these things for myself in this book. It was a process of learning about myself too. And my marriage ending was something that forced me to learn things about myself, you know, and I'm really grateful for that actually. I think one of the healing processes, people have said to me, was it cathartic to write this book, and that's not really how I felt about it. I think one of the healing things is that feeling of having learnt something, you know, because you can be grateful for having learnt something, and gratitude is an antidote to despair, right? So it's like, oh, I learned something. And sometimes learning stuff is really hard, and you've got to grieve the loss of the other knowledge that you thought was knowledge you had, you know. So I'm interested in how the writing process can help me articulate what I'm learning to myself, maybe almost, and then share that. So there's a possible other book of essays. Maybe not next year.
We'll give you 2 years. Well, look, that's a lovely note to end. Would you all join me in thanking Cristín very much for her time tonight?